community level. We just saw a situation this weekend with O.J. Simpson as to how just through the use of his cellular telephone that he was able to be picked up from satellite and located on the planet. And it's really important that we begin to understand what these technologies are, whether it's the use of laser, microwave, radio waves, TV waves, cosmic waves, ultraviolet light, etc., what this really is. And to my surprise and true thankfulness, I'm understanding that what I am seeing before my very eyes is an externalization, an external manifestation of my own innate gifts and talents. Yes, it's very important for you to begin to understand that melanin is the complete composite of all forms of light, known and unknown to us. Now, I just want you to think about that for a minute, because when you are actually looking into the blackness, the bleakness, whether that's into your face, whether that's into a dark room, whether that's actually looking up at the sky, you are actually looking at all forms of light. Really, for the best that I can describe to you, you are really looking into the face of the Creator. Now, if we want to go back as far as Egyptian times, I think one of the most controversial pharaohs, excuse me, Akhenaten or Akhenaten, depends on how you pronounce that, was known as the Pharaoh of the Sun. And the interpretations by Lubowitz and other hieroglyphic or Egyptian historians really were not able to truly translate why this particular Pharaoh and his entire dynasty was quite focused on the sun and sun worshiping. It wasn't as though they were actually just worshiping an object that they happened to have chosen within their environment, but the understanding of recognizing that this was a greater emanation of oneself. That's what actualizing and honoring the sun was about, recognizing that not only does the sun shine in the daytime, but also at nighttime, because what you are seeing is a greater manifestation of more forms of light at night than in the day. Now, let's just look at that. I don't know how many of you had basic, how can I describe that, color identification in first, second, third grade, etc. They asked you to name 3 primary colors, and then you had to name their complementary colors, and they had you mix them together in paint, and you had to explain what you were seeing. How did you make yellow? How did you make blue? How did you get purple, brown, etc.? But the key here is that it's very important to understand that where there is no light or very little light reflects itself as being pale or white. And when there is intense color of a deep, deep intensity, it always manifests itself as being darkened or actually black. Now, what am I saying then when we're actually talking about this substance known as melanin? Let me just give you a little history here. There's so much information on this, and the more I review this, the more work I realize is available for me. I'm not going to bother us with a lot of this scientific data, because I want you to leave here today with a clear understanding of when you look at your face, when you're washing your skin, when you're happening to look down at a black shoe, and I happen to like black patent leather shoes a lot, and it's a real scientific reason why. There was a play that came out that patent leather shoes, black patent leather shoes always reflect up. And at the end of this lecture, I hope you begin to understand why, because it's actually the front and back are double intensity of the full electromagnetic spectrum of light. Okay? So, to your surprise, I think that you should begin to recognize that, again, on a written scientific basis, melanin began to be studied as early as 1658. It was interesting that this gentleman by the name of Lecher, a French gentleman, found it was very interesting to note that in certain animals, whether they're frogs or they were cockroaches, etc., that they had this substance known as what they call a basic pigment that allowed them to have particular colors. In 1737, there was a gentleman by the name of Albinus who recognized and was able to identify that this particular pigment had specific characteristics and was interested in finding out where it originated from. Now, it was interesting that his name, being spelled A-L-B-I-N-U-S, albinus, had been coined also as the precursor to a particular disease where this pigment was not present, or albinism. Now, in the United States, one of the foremost gentlemen in pigmentation research, his name is known as John Mitchell, and he's located at Harvard University. And there is a whole center there at Harvard University, and has been there for the last 40 years, that does nothing but research on pigmentation and all of its aspects. Now, in 1826, there's a gentleman by the name of Linnet who was able to describe that this pigmentation was contained in a cellular structure known as a melanocyte, in little granular forms known as melanosomes, and that these tissues could undergo abnormal functioning to produce what now is known as melanoma, or cancer. In 1987, there was a journal that scientists have put together known as the Journal of Pigment Cell Research, that has been in publication and that is produced every month on cells of pigment. How many of you are subscribers? How many of you have any idea that there is a medical journal that's put out every month on your pigment? Do you have any idea what's in it? Fine. It's interesting that out of all the cells studied in the body, the most important and the most common cell studied is the red blood cell. Next to that, or second, is the nerve cell or the neuron, and then thirdly is the melanocyte. Now, I think it's very interesting that at least on the news and in the newspapers, we are told about what blood cells do to some capacity and about different neurologic diseases, multiple sclerosis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, etc. But now, I haven't heard in these general information centers that the third most intense studied cell is the melanocyte. Have you? But scientifically, though, when the money is looked at as to what parts of the body the most money and research is spent on, it's the red blood cell first, the nerve cell, and then it's melanin. Now, again, there's a gentleman by the name of Thomas B. Fitzpatrick, who's also at Harvard University, who had been doing this research on melanin for the last 40 years. And they have one of the largest libraries and one of the most extensive research centers on pigmentation and melanin there. Now, in my book, I talk about some basic things about what melanin does, what it does not do, its sensitivities, etc. And I think that I should just review that very quickly. I wanted to talk about some updated aspects of melanin because I want to tie this in specifically to, again, a lot of the technologies and sciences that we're looking at. But do understand that I want you to be stimulated to definitely begin to do further readings and studying on melanin. There's all kind of data available, but it's not in the most typical sources. But when you do run into the source, you will find hundreds of thousands of articles on all different types of melanin and what it does. I talked about in my book, for example, that because of this molecule and because of its relationship to us, it has to be addressed under all circumstances in every aspect of our life. This is not just something that colors our hair, colors our eyes, etc., but it actually is the foundation from which the cells of our bodies have originated. It's very interesting. They talk about something that happens within the first 3 days after conception, that something known as a neural crest forms. And this neural crest is responsible for producing our entire nervous system, the spinal cord, the peripheral nerves, and the brain. And whether this is completely formed properly or not depends on the presence of melanin. When melanin is not there or it is in abnormal amounts, then this is when we begin to have neurologic defects, retardation, and one of the most common problems with melanin deficiency is spina bifida. So cerebral dystrophy, cerebral palsy, all of these things happen to deal with the health and the amount of melanin that's present at the time of conception. All races on the planet have melanin, but its capacity to be produced, the type that's produced, and its capacity to interact with the external environment is a genetic decision. And so therefore, when you are looking at Caucasians, these individuals do have melanin, but they have a very interesting type. It's a very, very small structure, and they are clustered together kind of like little granules or cracker crumbs. So you can get the idea that instead of having these nice round beach balls of a particular pigment in a cell, they're all clustered together in little crumbs in a particular corner of the cell. And so therefore, it appears, because they're all folded up, that you can't see this pigmentation. Now I wanted you to get this very clear of what's happening, because it's just like you having a sheet that's a beautiful pattern, but if the sheet is all folded up and you fold it up to the size of this book, you're not going to be able to appreciate that if you put it in the middle of the floor, as opposed to taking the entire king-size sheet and folding it totally out flat and then putting it in the middle of the floor. It actually takes up the whole attention of the room. Well, this is the main difference that happens between different races and also with the different interactions that occurs with melanin. That is to say that because this substance is crumpled up, folded on top of itself, it has very little reactivity with the environment and has a very limited capacity to relay information to the nerves, to the brain, so that the cells of the body will know what to do because of the particular environment. For example, what am I saying? It's interesting that melanin, as I said, does not originate from skin cells. It originates directly from the brain. So if you happen to be looking at yourself and you recognize that you are jet black in the mirror, and you recognize that for every melanocyte that you have, and normally in Africans we have somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 melanosomes per square millimeter of skin, that you are actually looking at an external brain. So that means that if you are incredibly black, when you look in the mirror, you are looking at an externalization of your brain. And I just want you to think about how awesome that is, because that means now that you have two brains. You have one that's outside that can see, feel, touch everything, plus you have one that's also in here, up at the top part of your body. Now, so you have to understand that if there's another individual standing next to you that has no pigmentation, which means that they have very little melanin, or that it's folded up on itself very tightly, like the sheet in the middle of the floor, then who should have the greatest sensory capacity on any level? Obviously the person who's standing out there with a brain outside of them and one that's also within them. Now that's awesome. Okay, now that's really important to understand. Now it's very interesting because they did some experiments with animals, for example, that based on the eye, because the eye has only two primary colors. The eye is either naturally dark brown or black, or it is blue, naturally. Any other shades of color of the eye are a reflection of toxins that have been deposited upon the iris. So any hazel eye is a toxic condition. So you either have blue eyes, or you either are supposed to have dark brown eyes or black. The black dark brown eye is a natural sunglass, because on the top of the nerve, from the back of the eye, it has been protected with melanin, so that the capacity to look into the sun, the capacity to be exposed to ultraviolet radiation, the capacity to be exposed to cosmic waves, radio waves, etc., have much less effect directly on the nerves from a damaging perspective, as opposed to that eye that is denuded or doesn't have any pigment. So therefore, it is quite sensible and intelligent for individuals that have hazel eyes or blue eyes that they must have some type of external protection across the eye when it is exposed to intense light. Now, they found something very interesting, is that every particular part of the brain also has to be illuminated by light. If the brain isn't illuminated by light, then it actually stops functioning. So I think this is very interesting because what did they do? They took some children and they exposed them and raised them in totally white rooms. These individuals spoke only because of the individuals who would come in and stimulate them. They basically did not elicit very much brain function at all, being raised in a totally white environment. Now, if you were listening to what I was saying, I told you what, on an electromagnetic basis, the white light is. It is actually very little light. So because these individuals were not allowed to actually see blue, green, yellow, beige, purple, etc., there was very little stimulation to the brain to actually keep the electromagnetic circuitry working, to stimulate the cells to communicate to one another, which is what produces intelligence. So that's why they have found that when we look at the psychology of colors, that when we use pastel colors or muted colors, they automatically allow the person to think less. So we call that relaxing, because there's very little light or stimulation related to the brain, and so therefore it allows us to basically not appear alert and have to be stimulated to think about making a decision about anything or absorbing it. So that's why in the doctor's offices now, who are really into making your visit painless and relaxing, they will have very pale grays, very pale lavenders, etc., to actually decrease the stimulation to your brain, because now they're actually cutting out full light spectrum so that you can actually go into a state really of what I call kind of intellectual retardation, because it's a form of actual malnourishment from the lack of light. There's a gentleman that has done a tremendous amount of research with light exposure and health. His name is John Ott, and he recognized that irregardless of what race you are, you have to be exposed to a certain amount of light to be able to stay healthy, to maintain a healthy immune system, and most of all, to actually remain intelligent. And this gentleman was a Caucasian, and I thought it was very interesting that he even joined with MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, doing studies with lower animals to prove that you could actually determine the reproductive capacity of an animal. You could determine the sex that the animal was able to reproduce. You could determine the intelligence. You could determine the health of an individual just by manipulating the light intensity and the colors that the animal was exposed to. So it was very interesting. They decided to do some research with chinchillas and minks, because it happened to be a farmer who was having some problems maintaining his mink and chinchillas because only females were being born into the litter. And so therefore there were no males being born, so he could not continue his litters. And so he didn't know whether it was in the feed or what the problem was. Well, John Ott went there and recognized that the frequency of the lights in the pens was adverse to stimulating the production of male species, minks and chinchillas. Now, there's a book that has just come out by a gentleman by the name of Leahy, if I'm not mistaken. And the name of the book is Sex and the Brain. And what this gentleman has actually identified is that he's a pathologist, is that as he looked at the brains that were coming through his laboratory, he recognized that all brains are female. And research now is showing that if a developing fetus who is destined to be male is not exposed to testosterone in the uterus 2 to 3 weeks prior to birth, and then again 2 to 3 months after birth, that this individual will have problems having an affinity toward the opposite sex or complete male development. Now, I thought that was very interesting, and this person has really been bombarded on TV in relationship to dealing with the propensity for bisexual, heterosexual activity. We have a problem with that now, with many people having sexual identity issues. And with the advent of being exposed to more radiation, more laser rays, mothers are cooking food now with microwave ovens. We're being exposed to all kinds of unnatural lights, all different spectrums of lighting in our home, that it appears that this is probably going to be identified as one of the major problems that is happening to the mothers during the gestational period, that they are being either bombarded with abnormal frequencies of light or that they are not actually receiving enough light, and this is actually a problem. We are already noticing that women who are working 8 to 10 hours a day and doing close eye work, that is, if they're reading a lot, automatically and naturally will produce female children almost 9 to 1 as opposed to male children. We're also noticing that women who are exposing themselves again to very high frequencies of radiation from computers, or that they're working with microwaves, etc., their children are born with a greater risk of mutations, hernias, a lot of other things. So I'm very concerned about this in the melanin dominant community, and those individuals who have outright melanin must become aware of what does it mean when they're actually walking into a field of microwave. Many times we go places and there's a sign that says, you know, don't enter if you have a pacemaker, okay, because this is a high microwave field. What does that mean if you are actually jet black and you're in that field? Not that you have a pacemaker, but actually how does that affect the melanin molecule? If you are melanin recessive, how does that actually affect you? Because now we're finding out that these high frequencies of light, and when I say high frequencies of light, I'm talking about those frequencies of light that we normally cannot perceive or see unless it's reflected back to us through a machine. Okay, you have to understand what I'm saying. For example, most people do not know that they are being exposed to ultraviolet radiation unless it is being measured by a machine or it's being actually reflected back to you through some type of instrument. You don't know that you're in a field of radio waves unless you actually have a radio there that can actually reflect that back to you. Now, some of the interesting things that are happening that we're finding out about melanin when we look back at many of the hieroglyphs, many of the codices in Mexico, and many of the ancient writings in Africa, is that people were always able to communicate with each other mentally and be able to talk to each other verbally and be able to play musical instruments by drums and communicate hundreds and hundreds of miles away. Now, we are also noticing, and we also are aware of the fact that radio waves can be perceived by any individual that is sensitive to these waves that is melanin dominant. And this is one of the things that Frances Cress Welsing talks about when she talks about the Dogon people and their capacity to have used the stars in the sky as designs for their clothing, to paint the outside of their huts, etc., because they were walking X-ray films. Now, what does that mean? If any of you are astronomers, you know that there's getting ready to be an experience of an interesting phenomenon that hasn't happened for millions of years. That is, that there are bodies that are going to collide with Jupiter, okay, next month, starting the 16th or so, okay, that are going to have a profound effect on this planet. These meteorites, there's going to be a meteorite shower that will be hitting Jupiter that will be felt definitely upon Earth. Now, these meteorites and other star systems can be identified, and there's now all kind of thousands of volumes of star charts available in the planetariums because of radio wave X-rays. So what happens is that they have particular X-ray plates that are sensitive to radio waves that they expose through a telescope pointing in the direction where they suspect there is a star. The long wave radio waves bombard the plate because it is a form of light, expose it, and then they develop the plate and then calculate the amount of light there based on star years to determine how far the star is away, how big it is, etc. Now, as I said, melanin is the physical manifestation of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So that means that wherever you are, any light that is like you, your melanin is going to be able to pick that up and relay it to your brain, because every granule of melanin is directly sitting on a nerve ending, because it is a neuron. It's a form of brain tissue. So if you happen to be jet black and you're walking around outside and there's a particular star that's up in the sky, the amount of light that's being pulsated from this particular star will actually hit your melanin granules. Your nerves will then relay that to the brain, and it will make an image. So these individuals then knew that as they lived from month to month, year to year, that there would be certain patterns in the sky, and they just actually recorded them on paper, on straw, on their clothing. So then when the Europeans were able to find out where this tribe was, however they discovered them, and one individual happened to recognize that these were actually the same patterns of heavenly bodies that they had to create a radio telescope and special x-ray film to be able to know that these bodies were up there. These individuals are walking around with no clothing on and no shoes. How could they have the same star charts? And the reason is because the melanin functions the same way. Now, many of our ancestors, our immediate ancestors, grandparents, great-grandparents, have talked about the visions that they've had, the voices that they've had, and even our little children are all the time talking to beings and entities. Now, they are actually hearing at a distance and also hearing in different dimensions. Now, these things were all known to us. But for whatever reason, and that we won't go into that this time because we're going to stay strictly on melanin, we have begun to ignore and to educate this awareness out of ourselves, which causes us to have specific and severe problems in being able to communicate. This is a tremendous gift that allows us to be able to be aware of all things in all areas that we might be in. And our knowledge of ourselves and what it is that we might be perceiving is very, very important for us to be able to be aware of. Let me talk about some things in here that I think are very basic before we go on for us to understand. Now, when I decided that I needed to write down on paper a lot of the information that I had discovered, I chose something that most of us had been exposed to, minerals and vitamins, to begin to give this information as to how something so simple as a mineral and vitamin might be different in concentration or type based upon the amount of melanin that you have. But when I began to look at the biochemistry of melanin, it was very interesting to recognize that many of the vitamins and minerals that are prescribed are part of the melanin molecule already. Vitamin D is part of the melanin molecule. All you have to do is go outside for 20 minutes and stand in the sun, and your body makes vitamin D for you. It's something that you never have to take. So it made sense to me then that those individuals who lived in the north, where there was very little sun, okay, let me just, give you some further information on vitamin D. We need vitamin D to be able to absorb and utilize calcium. So, if you lived in the north where there is very little sun and you stayed there long enough, eventually you wound up being very pale and having what appears to be no melanin. So obviously you need calcium for your bone structure, your hair and nails. How are you going to get it? Well, you can't make it from the melanin because you don't have it. So therefore, a big research project took effect to find out what outside of ourselves could be identified to make melanin, since we no longer could make it from within. And it was discovered that cod liver oil was very high in vitamin D. So if we caught these fish and took the fat off of them and stored it and took a little bit every day, then we'd be able to hold on to our calcium and absorb that was in our food. So now when you recognize that, and you realize that now you're standing there in the store next to somebody who's jet black, and they come over and they ask you what type of vitamin D or cod liver oil would be good for them, what do? Because you know that this individual does not need cod liver oil, and as a matter of fact, them taking cod liver oil starts to actually produce crystallization and hardening in their soft tissues. So they start getting all these little lumps and knots and things under the skin and in the muscle because they have too much vitamin D and they're absorbing and holding on to too much calcium that can't be deposited in the bone, so then the body has to take it and deposit it somewhere else, but calcium is not supposed to be there. We found out that riboflavin, for example, and pyridoxine are normal parts of the melanin molecule, where pyridoxine and riboflavin are very important to prevent certain skin diseases and to propel certain reactions to occur in the body. As long as you have melanin, you don't ever need to take these particular vitamins. Now it's very interesting because when I did the research, I noticed that many health books, many health practitioners are talking about niacin. That if you have poor circulation, that you should take niacin because niacin opens up your circulation so that the tissues can get oxygen. But when I did the research on niacin, I found out that niacin is a byproduct of the toxic drug known as nicotine, and that it was not a vitamin at all. It is actually an addictive drug known as nicotine. It's a byproduct of that. But this particular byproduct of nicotine has the capacity to cause the superficial blood vessels to dilate. So I was like, oh, that's real interesting. Well, let's find out more about that. Well, I found out that individuals who have very clumpy melanin, which appears as though they don't have any, what we call melanin recessive individuals, also do not have a complete, well-developed superficial circulation. So it's very interesting because as I talked about earlier, the fact that the more melanin you have, you also have a nerve ending connected to the melanin granule, which means you have two brains, one outside and one inside your head. Now, for all those melanin granules you have, especially the darker you are, you've got to get oxygen to them. So the body knows that and makes sure that you have a circulatory system that will carry the blood to the melanin granule so that it will stay alive to relay information to the nerve that it's attached to so that it gets back to your brain so you can make a decision about what it is that you found out is going on in your environment. So therefore, the melanin dominant individual has two circulatory systems. A deep circulatory system and a superficial circulatory system, just like they have an internal and external brain. Individuals who are melanin recessive only have a deep circulatory system and they do not have a well-developed superficial circulatory system. So therefore, because they knew that about themselves, they had to have a means of being able to drive the blood to the skin. So when they found out about niacin that causes the superficial blood vessels to dilate, this was an excellent idea to take this so that the superficial blood vessels could get bigger so that more blood could get to the skin. And to then make it something essential in your diet, that is to make it a vitamin, would mean that you would always ensure, if you taught your children this, that this was something that they would make sure that they would want to have. Now I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. So this isn't even a vitamin, and it's not even something that we're supposed to take. Because now when we look at the effect of what nicotine does to the melanin molecule, it's horrendous. Nicotine actually just about deactivates the melanin molecule. It actually causes a sludging effect, and it actually diminishes its capacity to actually even pick up frequencies of light to relay the information to the brain. So it's very, very interesting because unlike Caucasians that smoke heavily, when we look at the whites of the eye, when we look at the color or luster of the skin of melanin-dominant individuals that take in nicotine, it totally shuts their lights out. That is to say that you can walk up the street and see a black person who smokes because they look like someone has blown soot on their face. They have no luster at all, there's no light, there's no sheen at all on their face. You do not see that in Caucasians who smoke. The way that you can tell they're smokers is that you can look at their fingers where they hold the cigarette and see the actual nicotine deposit in the skin or see the discoloration on their teeth. But you can't look in their face and tell whether they're smokers or not, because they don't have the melanin that actually circulates the light through the skin for you to see if it is actually now dysfunctional or not working because of the reaction of the nicotine. So it's not coincidental that the smoker also, who is melanin dominant, especially has problems with loss of sensory perception. That is, that they can get burned easy because now the melanin that would normally feel the heat, because it's not active, they don't feel that anymore. So they get numbness in their hands, tingling in their hands, tingling in their feet. They also begin to lose their sense of taste. And they have to start using much more salt, eating more spicier foods, etc., because the melanin molecule now, the nicotine in the cigarette smoke is now actually diminishing the entire sensitivity of the nervous system. So I'm like, oh, now this is very, very interesting. So when they have this old adage, one man's medicine is another man's poison, very, very true in the case of nicotine and being melanin recessive or melanin dominant. Now, we went on to look at some other interesting things. We went on to find out, for example, that the melanin loves fat. It loves fat. And so anytime there's fat put in the body, it actually bonds to the melanin molecule and is used very slowly. And in many circumstances, it's recycled. So therefore, melanin-dominant individuals do not have to have high-fat diets to maintain their body fat. Because when they eat that, it's actually bound to the melanin molecule and recycled. So therefore, there was a whole story and a study. Some hospitals have been doing studies on African women to find out why it is that they're the most fattest women in the world. Now, obviously, I know the answer. It's because they have a substance in their body that loves fat already. And so therefore, if they eat diets that are extremely high in fat, animal fat especially, hamburgers, meat of any type that is high in fat, because their body will already store fat and they put extra fat inside their bodies and they don't release it because the melanin binds it on. That's why they're the fattest women in the world, because they eat inappropriately for their body metabolism, physiology, and structure. Now I said, well, that's real interesting, because now why would we have this gift? I'm always into looking at everything as a gift, not a problem. So when you look at it as a gift, then that automatically then gives you insight as to how you can use it for your advantage, not to reject it. So I'm like, okay, now the Creator gave us this gift. We can eat just a little fat and we'll keep it for 5 years. Now what's the reason for that? Well, then when I went back and looked at, well, where do all these people live primarily that have this propensity to store fat? And they live in an area that is very hot and that most of the foods there have very little fat. So if you're living at the equator and it's 110 degrees every day, if you know anything about energies, sugar, fat, and protein, when it is broken down by the body, gives off energy. That's why we eat. Out of all the 3 building blocks of the body, the fat molecule gives off the highest concentration of energy. So that is to say that if it was 110 degrees outside, and if you killed an animal and sat down and ate it, you would overheat your body and would have a heat stroke. Not because it was too hot outside, but because you ate a substance that when your body breaks it down, gives out so much heat that from the heat from the outside and the heat that's generated from within, it would totally short-circuit your normal functioning capacity. Now, all you have to do is just try this out today. The last time I heard it was 92 degrees. So now you just go to Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's or someplace and get you a hamburger. And just sit there and eat it. And see what happens to you in a half hour. Just sit right there on the bench and just eat it and see what happens to you in a half hour. You will become so miserable you cannot stand it. And so your natural reaction is going to be that you want something that has ice in it, something that's cold, or you got to get to the air conditioner fast. And this is very interesting because when I was a child, I was very concerned one year. I must have been about 7 years old, and that's all I heard was sirens going up and down the street, and on the news they were cautioning everybody about it being too hot and having heart attacks. Now this was before it was popular for everybody to have air conditioning, and they were even giving out fans to the older people to cool them down. Because with the temperature being so hot this time of this particular summer, so many people were having heart attacks that the hospitals couldn't help them. And I said, what is happening? As a little kid, I said, what is happening that would cause, that would cause so many people to have heart attacks? But when I began to do the studying years later, I recognized that again, all these people forgot about the normal physiology, of the food constituents, and they were all sitting there this hot summer eating this meat. But because there were no air conditionings and they didn't have any fans, it was overheating their bodies, and they were actually having heart attacks and angina and were having to go to the hospital. So now I recognize that we can tolerate an enormous amount of heat when we eat properly and eat in alignment with our normal physiological structure. Now let me tell you about heat and the melanin molecule. Carol Barnes writes a lot about this. This is how he got interested in doing the research on melanin. Okay, thank you. He was given an assignment to find out what he could do to